Hello everybody, Damon Parr here with Internal Flame Outdoors. This video series talks about landowners working together across property lines to manage the whitetail deer. In today's video, I want to talk about some of the benefits of sharing trail camera photos. The first benefit I want to talk about is sharing trail camera photos with your neighbors allows more young deer to survive. The second benefit is sharing photos allows us to identify young deer that maybe don't have the potential to grow into your great deer. So they don't have the potential to have a very big rack on their head. Number three, sharing trail camera photos with our neighbors allows us to identify young deer that do have the potential to be very big deer. Your deer that are going to turn into, your 160, 170, 180 class bucks or even bigger. The deer that we all want to survive when we're managing for a trophy class animal. At number four, it allows us to identify old bucks that maybe didn't grow a big rack. So your old, mature 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old bucks that are only like 120, 130 inches, great deer to harvest. So let's move right into number one. Sharing trail camera photos allows more young deer to survive. So if a 170-inch buck runs across the field with a 115-inch buck, which deer is the hunter going to shoot at? Okay, trail camera photos work in the same way. So maybe a landowner doesn't have very many mature bucks or bucks that he would like to harvest on camera if he's managing for a trophy class animal. But if we share photos and he knows that his neighbors have bucks on camera that he would really like to harvest, maybe only a quarter mile or a half mile away, then the landowner knows that he might have the opportunity to harvest those bucks at some point, and that's exciting. And there's a higher chance that the people that are hunting on that landowner's land that doesn't have the mature bucks at the moment, there's a higher chance that they're going to pass younger deer. Okay, let's move into number two. Sharing trail camera photos allows us to identify young deer that don't have the potential to be very big. So, deer are like people. We all grow to different sizes. Same with the deer. There's not many deer that are gonna get into that, 160 or bigger range. So if we can identify young deer that don't have the potential to be that big, then that creates more hunting opportunities for hunters on your property that maybe haven't had the chance to harvest that many bucks. It can be frustrating if you're a hunter who's hunting on heavily managed land and you're going out there to sit in your stand and there's only a couple deer that you can shoot. It's kind of like a needle in a haystack game. But usually there's these young deer that, they're just not going to get very big. They're only going to top out at 120, 130 inches. So they're great deer to harvest. And this makes it more exciting for those hunters who, need to harvest some of those, I call them progress bucks, to move on to that next level. We have like 115-inch, 3.5-year-old buck in 2020 on our property. He's like 16 inches wide, short tines. He might be a little bit bigger next year. He might turn into something that I don't think he's going to turn into, but most likely he's just going to be a little bit bigger. And he's one of those deer that's a great deer to harvest to get him out of the breeding cycle. You don't want that gene line running around where you have, an 18-inch fully mature 8-pointer that only scores 120 inches. Here's an example of the type of deer that I was talking about. I was watching this buck. He's 4.5 here when I harvested him, and I couldn't believe, when he turned 4.5, he only turned into this, like tight racked buck, and we identified him as a great deer to harvest, and I was happy to take him. Okay, let's move into number three. Sharing trail camera photos with your neighbors allows us to identify young bucks that do have the potential to be your Boone and Crockett bucks or even bigger. These are the deer that we want to survive. There's usually only a couple of deer like this on any given property where if they can just make it past that 3.5, 4.5, then you might be looking at your Boone and Crockett buck. The problem is it's usually the big framed 3.5-year-old that's in serious jeopardy if everyone isn't sharing pictures and identifies this deer. You know, you hear a lot of times people will say young deer are dumb. I agree and I disagree with that. You know, young deer haven't established their range. So a 3.5-year-old buck is just moving around a lot more, trying to figure out where he fits into this whole process. And it puts his livelihood at serious risk because more people are going to see him. So, you know, if that big racked 3.5-year-old buck runs onto a neighbor's property and they have to make a quick decision, you know, they might think that that's a big mature deer if it's hard to judge body size or whatever, and then bam, your next year booner is gone. And you know, there's a lot of areas where people are trying to manage to get that age type of deer, but if they're not sharing photos, then they might make that mistake, you know, that mistake where you have the ground shrinkage, where it's not something that you wanted to harvest. So, you know, we had a 4.5-year-old 9-pointer on our property in 2020, and he was a 140-inch buck. He's got that type of frame where he could explode, right? So we identified him and we collectively passed him 7 times, 4 different hunters that I know about just on this property alone. So, you know, next year he really has the opportunity to be a 160 class buck, and, you know, great beyond that. So it's awesome to be able to identify those deer and collectively say, okay, it's only these 2 or 3 deer that need to survive. You know, that's it. And any other deer can be harvested, but these are the ones that need to survive if we want to have a Boone and Crockett buck running around. Okay, let's get into number 4. Sharing trail camera photos allows us to identify old deer that, you know, haven't matured to have that big rack on their head. These are, you know, your cull buck or management deer or whatever you like to call them. And this is one of my favorite parts of sharing trail camera photos because it just, again, creates more harvest opportunities. You know, a lot of times these 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old bucks will slip by a hunter who's hunting in a heavily managed area because the deer isn't identified. So they're like, well, gosh, his rack doesn't look very big. I don't want to make a mistake, you know. And in actuality, they just let a 7.5-year-old buck walk by. So it's super important for everyone to share pictures to take these bucks again out of the gene pool, get them out of the breeding process, and great deer to harvest. You know, I get more excited about body size than I do about rack size, just these big mature animals. The problem is if a hunter hasn't been able to visually see a lot of bucks that have mature bodies, they can be very hard to identify. So again, these bucks will tend to slip by people if they're hunting on, you know, heavily managed property because they don't want to make a mistake. I'm talking about deer like this deer. This is a 5.5-year-old buck that I harvested. We called him Bulldog. The only reason I knew about this deer is because my neighbor shared pictures with me. He lived on my neighbor's property to the north for most of his life. And I was able to harvest him during the rifle season. He was just a tank. You know, he weighed 195 pounds, field dressed, almost at December 1st. It was just awesome to be able to take this buck. So let's review. Sharing trail camera photos allows more young deer to survive. Number 2, it allows us to identify young deer that don't have the potential to be very large rack bucks to create more hunting opportunities, more harvest opportunities. Number 3, sharing trail camera photos allows us to identify young deer that do have the potential to be very big rack deer, you know, the 2 or 3 bucks that we want to survive every year. And then number 4, it allows us to identify old deer that, you know, haven't matured into that large racked buck you know, your cull buck or management type deer you want everybody to know about, because again, they create great harvest opportunities and good deer to harvest and get out of the gene pool. I hope you liked this content. If you did, please like and subscribe. Please visit our website at Eternal Flame Outdoors. The link is in the description below. Thank you for watching.